Committee will now come to order. We're convened as of 12:01 p.m. and this is July 21, 2022. I would respectfully ask everyone attending this meeting to mute yourself unless you're recognized to speak. I will now call the roll. First Vice Chair Geisinger.
Here.
Second Vice Chair Catlin.
Here.
Secretary Sloan.
Here.
Treasurer Whitmore.
Present.
And Chair Busick is here. Other directors in attendance include Director Tisdale. Welcome, Director Tisdale. Good to see you. Staff in attendance are Deborah Johnson, Jillian Knapp Rhodes, Brandy Hunter, Marie Snell, Patrick Paris, Michael Davies, Barbara McManus, John McKay. And if I've missed anybody, please speak up. Public comment is next. I would like to open public comment to anyone who would like to address the committee regarding any topic listed in the published meeting agenda for the current and immediately preceding month. If you wish to speak and have not already done so, please either raise your virtual hand or press *9 on your phone. Staff will unmute you when it is your turn to speak. If you are dialed in, press *6 to toggle your mute settings. Please bear in mind that by participating in this process, you are being recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, then your comments will need to be submitted in writing. If any speaker has documentation or reference materials for the committee, or if any member of the public would like to submit written comments, please email those materials to the board office at the following email address: rtd.boardoffice@rtd-denver.com. During public comment, the committee will not offer comments or responses. Directors or staff may contact speakers following their comments if they raise matters that lend themselves to follow-up. Speakers should begin their remarks by stating their names, and each speaker will have 3 minutes to speak. Ms. McManus, do we have any speakers in the queue?
I see no hands up in the queue, and there were no communications in the Board of Directors email box.
Great, with no participants in the queue and no emailed comments, we'll close the public comment period at this time. Hang on 1 second. There is one recommended action on the agenda this afternoon, and before I start that, I have a question for our General Counsel, Melanie Snyder. Melanie Snyder, here's the question. So with regard to paragraph 6 of the draft of the amended delegation, I want to add a small phrase at the end of one sentence. Should I do that as part of the motion, or should we do the motion second and then do an amendment to go through that whole process?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. You know what I'd recommend, just so we can see how this discussion unfolds, I would just recommend that you do a regular motion to adopt, start discussion, and then let's collect any potential amendments as we go along the way, and then potentially make those as one motion.
Okay, good. Thanks for that clarification. So recommended action is for the Board of Directors to approve resolution number blank series of 2022 regarding delegation of authority and competitive selection, which updates the delegations of purchasing and contracting, budget transfer, and settlement authority consistent with the board's bylaws, the RTD Act, regulations published by the Federal Transit Administration, and the board's historical practices, with the exception of certain contracts and other matters enumerated within the resolution. Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
And Director Sloan, do I have a second?
Second.
I had 3, I think. So I heard Director Whitmore first. So Director Whitmore is the second. And I'll talk about this, but do we have any discussion at this point? So by way of background, we just start with that. There were a number of comments from members of the Executive Committee and the Board of Directors with regard to the original delegation of authority. And these comments consisted of concerns and other expressions by board members regarding certain types of contracts that historically have come before the board for approval, but were authorized by the prior delegation. So in order to correct that situation, we have decided, some of us, at least the mover and the second, have decided to amend the delegation to clarify those types of contracts that should come before the board. Are there any further discussion or any amendments by any members of the executive committee? At this point, I would propose an amendment. And is this the proper time, Ms. Snyder?
Yes, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, I just had a few
Okay,
comments
I'm sorry.
that I wanted to raise for the executive
Sure.
committee's consideration, just to ensure that we have a fulsome understanding of what it is that's being adopted here, if that's okay.
You bet.
Okay, terrific. So a couple recommendations. One, I recommend that the executive committee or a member of the committee consider removing this from the consent agenda. I think it's an important delegation to the GM and CEO, and given that this didn't go through another standing committee, I think it's just good practice to ensure that we have some full and robust conversation. I think that some of the challenges last go around when the board adopted the March delegation, that was on the consent agenda, and there wasn't quite a bit of conversation. And I think that may have led to some of the directors feeling surprised about what was included in that. So that's one recommendation. The other is it doesn't sound like we were ready to have any conversation about the scope of the exclusions, but I think it's really important to get clarity around what it is that the board's adopting. So some of the different categories, for example, when you're talking about studies that might come to the board, there's obviously a range of studies that are done that are brought to the board later for action. So that could be everything as large as the Reimagine study, for example, or something as small as analysis that's done by our GIS surveying that consultant performs that work for annexation petitions and most recently with redistricting. So I think it's important to understand the scope of and the volume of potential contracts that are going to fall into these additional categories. The other would be, having some clarity around whether it's the intent of this action to make this retroactive or just moving forward. There was some language that was added to the end of the end of the resolution that talks about how the board retains all authority that's not included in this current resolution. That, of course, is the foundation of the board's authority. The board has plenary authority unless you delegate it away. But I do want to make sure that we have clear understanding and staff is really clear going forward. So, for example, the board recently approved the Northwest Rail study. The board recently approved a delegation to the general manager for Colorado BRT 119. So it's not clear to me whether the intent of this resolution is, because both of those would fall within the language of these proposed exclusions, is the intent that now that those prior delegations to the GM are rescinded, since it's not specifically set out in this resolution. Is the intent that every single amendment to the study or Northwest Rail or change order comes to the board? And then I think that there are potentially some opportunities to discuss the language with regard to the 25% amendment language. Chair, when you talked about how the intent of this resolution is to address contracts that would historically come to the board, making it clear that they should come to the board, I just want to flag, for example, that language right now, as stated, says that outside from these exclusions, the general manager has authority to execute amendments and change orders and exercise option years up to 25% of the original contract. I flag that because, as you all know, the board typically does approve our large contracted services contracts. So those could be, for example, in the $90 million range. As drafted and as adopted by the board right now, 25% of that could be exceeding $20 million, which of course is more than the general $2 million delegation. So I don't want anyone to be surprised, for example, because that is the way that delegation reads if those contracts and exercise of options don't come to the board. So those are just a few examples of what I wanted to highlight for just making sure that you all are clear on the scope of what you're adopting. The other, and I can certainly just defer to General Manager and CEO Johnson, is sort of the operational and administrative challenges potentially. It's certainly within the board's authority to request to be able to review scopes of work before those are put out for solicitation. And that is what this resolution is envisioning. I just want to make clear that this resolution is requiring then that every contract within the exclusions are going to come to the board for action a minimum of 2 times. first at the outset for review of the SAU and then for final approval after the procurement closes. That's not to say anything about potential amendments and change orders and exercises of option years. So I raise that just because I think it's important to recognize that it's possible that this could create some administrative challenges and some operational challenges that might prove unworkable. Certainly it's something that, I think Deborah Johnson can speak to. And then the other concern potentially I have, and I think it's nothing that we couldn't work through, but just highlighting what that might look for 15 directors reviewing a scope of work that could be potentially very highly technical. Are we envisioning that we're going to have 15 directors making motions? I think that's worth having a bit of discussion about. And then also keeping in mind that as you discuss, or as the board would discuss a potential scope of work, it's possible that members of the board could inadvertently share information that could put RTD at a negotiating disadvantage if vendors are hearing all of the business considerations that are going into the crafting of a scope. So I raise all of those not as a roadblock, but I just want you to all have a thoughtful discussion and make sure that you are understanding the implications of what's being proposed.
Great, thanks for those comments. I see first Vice Chair Geisinger hand up.
Great. I think GM CEO Johnson has her hand up
Great.
if she wants to go first.
Great. GM CEO Johnson, why don't you go first?
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very kindly. And thank you, General Counsel, for that. I just wanted to offer up, reading through the board report and the amendments, I'm seeking clarity as well, outside of what General Counsel raised. But when we look at the exclusions, for instance, when we talk about public meetings and things of the like, there's oftentimes things in which we need to do relative to having a public comment period. And one such example is the requirement pursuant to the FTA's guidance, especially when we look at inclusion relative to establishing a disadvantaged business enterprise goal. There's a process in which we have to do a 30-day public comment period. And so when we have public meetings of that nature, is that meant to be included there as well when we're going out to ensure that people understand what we're putting forth as a race conscious and a race neutral disadvantaged business enterprise goal? I broach that because that's something that we have to do on a triennial basis going forward as we get our DBE plan approved and also our goal approved. So I'm seeking some clarity as to what that means, because we will have to work that through a process and ensure that we are in compliance with the circular that is put out by the Federal Transit Administration. So that's one such example I wanted to provide, because upon reading the board materials, I was not clear as to what that would mean, because there is a lot of public input that we seek relative to our statutory and regulatory requirements and being a recipient of federal transit dollars. So I would appreciate having guidance from the board on this, because if it's the contrary, then we're going to have to start well in advance as we submit our uniform compliance reports twice a year. And I do not want to put this organization in a precarious position where we jeopardize the federal funding on which we receive, because we need to factor in working in tandem with the board to make those determinations, and keeping in mind the Western states decision and things of the like that we must adhere to. So I would appreciate any clarity that this board could provide me in doing what's best in the interest of this agency, especially as being recipients of federal dollars. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks for those comments. And I was just pulling up the section of the delegation. And where did I just lost it now? That would refer to, oh, static. So there's a section in the amended delegation on packet page 7 when we define some of the exclusions. That is public or community liaison or outreach consulting services, such as town hall meetings or other community input gathering services. And so I would assume, unless any other director has something to the contrary, if we are hiring a consultant to perform that service, then we would want to have a say in the in that type of a contract. If we're doing it ourselves, clearly doesn't fall within the exclusion. So I'm just wondering, how often do we hire contractors and consultants to do that type of work. And I lost my thing here. Hang on. God. So can anyone answer that to maybe do we hire consultant, Ms. Johnson, do we hire consultants to do that type of work?
Well, right, that's why I was posing the question, Mr. Chair. Thank you very kindly, because there could be a component in relationship to the other work we're doing. That's why I called out the DBE example, for instance. We may have a consultancy that we leverage in reference to garnering input from small disadvantaged businesses or other WEBs going forward, so they would understand the requirements specified as relates to our race neutral or race conscious goals. So that, for all intents and purposes, is still the retention of a consultant to provide a forum in which one can garner feedback, because we must present that in a public forum. So that's why I use that as an example, because as written, I would interpret that as coming forward to the board, because there's a facet of that. It's not a standalone, but for all intents and purposes, you can have a subcontractor that is leveraging that outreach component of an overarching initiative of which we have to adhere from a regulatory standpoint. And so that's why I needed some direction relative to that. So getting back to your point, oftentimes when we're garnering feedback, especially when we're trying to ensure that we are doing the people's work in an open and honest approach, that we would leverage some consultants and some entities. So it could be very small, looking at, surveying as we go out to garner input on some aspect of data collection. And I don't have the information readily available, but we could provide that and have our contracts and procurement staff query and see how many of those aspects come full circle within a larger contract. I don't know the time in which it would take to do that, but I do know that oftentimes there is that component. Another such example is using, community-based organizations to garner feedback. For instance, when we have 27 safe harbor languages and we're looking for people to engage with those populations, because we may not have the subject matter expertise in reference to cultural nuances. And so that still would be a public relations consultant having a town hall meeting. So that's the clarity in which I'm seeking. So that's just another example.
Right. And the example that you gave with regard to that type of outreach, would that be ultimately, would that information garnered through the contractor at the public meeting, would that specific example typically be something that comes back before the board for approval?
It would be in such a way when you look at a Title VI report, because there's certain aspects of it. We have to do we have to do a language assistance program. There's limited English proficiency. All of those components comprise the report in which we have to submit to the FTA. So there's different elements that overarchingly contribute to what the board weighs in on that we submit to the federal government for approval going forward. And so it's in light of the conversation that has ensued. That's why I'm seeking the clarity, because there's a lot of different pieces that enable us to collect that data as we move forward, so we can provide a comprehensive report in the interest of creating equal opportunities.
Right. So it sounds like you're saying that ultimately that example, that information would come before the board in some fashion for us to approve and take board action on. How often does that happen? That example, how often do you have to prepare that report and
Well, we just came to
hire a consultant and all?
Yes, we just came to you just a few months ago and brought forward the Title VI program that is required on a triennial basis. And so as we look at other aspects for your consideration, we could do some micro version of that when we're talking about, adding back transit service. We could, in some instance, leverage that going forward, especially if we're looking at a population and we want to ensure that we can go out and speak to somebody who is fluent in Khmer. And so that's still public outreach. And so to the point that you're asking, how frequently is it done? It's contingent upon a multitude of different issues. And as I said, I'm not in a position to give you a number, and I would not want to misspeak, but I just know in my experience that these elements help shape a program in which we're presenting.
Understood. So I guess based on all that discussion, my feeling would be to leave that in as is and see how things go. If it's too cumbersome, we can come back to amend, but I don't want to, what's the saying? Get rid of the good for the benefit of the perfect or something like that. So I know nothing's perfect. Any directors have any comments about any of these comments by Ms. Snyder or Ms. Johnson? First Vice Chair Geisinger, please.
Thank you. Yeah, just a couple of questions. Back to the comments from Ms. Snyder. You mentioned a couple of studies that we approved. And was your concern that change orders and amendments and options to extend would be too small for to be bringing to the board, that it would bring too many to the board? I didn't fully understand that.
Mr. Chair, if I may. Thank you. So the concern with that one is two parts. So one would potentially be the numerosity of the change orders and amendments, and also that they could be minor, that could actually, create some operational or administrative delays where it's not really something that rises to the level of such a high level policy concern that the board would really want to weigh in on. And then the second was the language that's added to the delegation. I'm looking at the red line on packet page 16 at the very bottom of that page. There was language that was added that says the board's powers not delegated to the general manager by this resolution are reserved to the board. And so my concern was whether the intent was to say with that language, there's nothing in here superseding or rescinding any prior delegation. That language, it's not clear what it's doing, what work it's doing, if it's not intended to be sort of retroactive to some of the other delegations that are outside this resolution.
So retroactive, I mean, we've approved those ones that you gave as an example, I think. So retroactive in what sense?
So the question would be, is the expectation, for example, that the Northwest Rail study or the Colorado BRT 119, that staff would now, because it's in the category of the subject matter exclusions, is the expectation that staff would be bringing all change orders, exercises of options, or any amendments for things that have already been approved?
So what would you suggest on that? That we have a minimum value or something, or?
I think that could be one option. I think the threshold question of that retroactivity would be really important to nail down first, and then you could kind of figure out how to add some language to kind of calibrate what gets brought to the board.
So retroactivity meaning that that something that's already been contracted, if there's an option to extend, that would come to the board, right? This came up with respect to our public affairs team. And I think that both of those contracts have, or maybe all three contracts have options to extend. So I guess that's an example of where that makes sense to have the option to extend come to the board. Those had always come to the board and they didn't now. But I see your concern. Change orders happen all the time. Maybe that's something we could look at. Is that what you'd recommend?
Yes, like I said, I think I would just recommend understanding what the intent of this updated resolution is with respect to existing contracts and ones that have already been approved by the board. Mm-hmm. And then looking to see looking to see how you identify what level of what threshold comes to the board if it's an amendment, because right now it's as drafted, it's saying all amendments would come to the board.
Yeah, I guess my thought would be it should apply for any contracts that are continuing, because we're going to be approving contracts in the future and it would apply there. But I hear your concern about, minimal change orders and amendments. I don't think that was what that was intended to cover. It might be something we want to look at, or, the committee may want to say what Director Busick said, Chair Busick said, that maybe we move forward and see. And then your other recommendation about the 25% amendment language, that 25% could be 20 million. Could you just run through that briefly for me again?
Sure. So I'm referring to packet page 15. That's the red line. So if at the top of that page in section 6, the existing language, and it's not an issue with respect to the red line, but the existing language says that contract amendments and change orders as may be necessary from time to time, not to exceed a cumulative total of 25% of the original contract. So I just wanted to be clear that language as drafted means that if you have a contract, so for example, we have multiple contracted services contracts for, in the $90 million range. Right now, this authorizes the GM and CEO to exercise an option year as long as it's below 25%. That obviously 25% is around $22 million. And so that is above the $2 million general delegation. And so I think there's an opportunity. I just want to be clear on whether, if the intent is that the general manager's authority outside the exclusions is capped at $2 million, that's not what that language says.
And First Vice Chair Geisinger, Ms. Snyder, my proposed amendment will address that. So just so you know, that one
Right.
issue. At least.
That's handy. Okay, that's my questions for now. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Second Vice Chair Catlin.
Thank you. Then General Counsel, it's bit my tongue. I think you talked about intent, and I think I would prefer not to overcomplicate this. And as Chair Busick said, let's kind of leave it as is, and then we can revisit it. One of the comments you made was with respect to scopes of work and having potentially 15 different sets of comments on a fairly technical issue. And I think this board was concerned more about the policy implications of scopes of work and not so much the minutia of the technical details. That's kind of the sense that I got from board members. So I can see where if people were inclined to comment on every little detail of the technical scope of work, that could be very cumbersome. But I think that the intent was really to take a higher level look at these scopes of work to ensure that there weren't some policy implications. And then with regard to GM CEO Johnson's comments about such things as the Title VI compliance, it seems to me that we could add some language in there that would say that, something with regard to regulatory requirements, that I think we should provide some latitude there, because if our Civil Rights Division needs to get a consultant to do some work to support that effort that's required by FTA or required by law, it seems to me we should not get in the way of them getting that work done in a timely fashion. That's my comment. Thank you.
Director Tisdale.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to address the executive committee in regards to this revised delegation memorandum. I've got 3 comments I'd like to present right now. I may have more later as the discussion goes on. Actually, 4 comments. The first is that I think Director Busick's intended amendment addresses some of the technical concerns that have been stated relative to this 25% situation. So I think that's going to be resolved. But going back to the question specifically as relates to, for example, the Title VI report, recall that's something that is a triennial exercise. That means it's every 3 years. So over the course of, and we just did it. So over the course of the next 36 months, I think we'll have a chance to see how this works and whether or not it needs tweaks. to paraphrase and perhaps update the comment from the chair, let not the perfect be the enemy of the good. And let's go ahead and see this and try it. Relative to the reservation clause at the end, the reservation clause is added for the sake of clarity and the avoidance of confusion. That's all. It is intended to make it very clear and to restate what the statute states, that the powers not specifically delegated are reserved. It's merely a restatement of the law. The third comment relative to retroactivity, my understanding is that it would not retroactively apply to the approval of contracts already approved and signed, but it would apply to change orders and amendments to those contracts. And I think that's clearly stated. And to repeat what several other directors on the committee have already stated, try it, you'll like it. And as we need to modify, we can do so. And I think we're in a position to do that. As of now, those are my comments, and I thank you for your patience.
Thanks for those comments. GMCEO Johnson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Tisdale, for your comments. A point of clarification, while I may have used the Title VI program as a reference that is done on a triennial review, to the point I was raising relative to our DBE goal, if we are not achieving the goal as set forward, we have the option to do a shortfall analysis and modify that based upon race conscious and race neutral goals, which could be done on an annual basis. And we submit a uniform report every 6 months. And so I want to be clear that it's not just happening on a triennial basis. I just use that as for a point of reference, more specifically as we talk about other regulatory compliance, recognizing that we have the Public Transportation Agency safety plan. We have to submit documentation in compliance with regulations. That too may constitute outreach efforts that we may be doing as well. So I just wanted to be clear that I've cited one such example, and it's not just on a 3-year basis. So thank you very much for the opportunity to clarify my statement.
Great, thanks for that. Director Tisdale, your hand's still up. You have something else to add? No, we're good. Ms. McManus, go ahead.
So I don't know the answer to this, but I just would like to put it out there. It's always been, the opportunity and the pleasure to bring things forward that the agency needs completed to move its business forward in a timely fashion. And I'm wondering, under some of these changes needing to be done in a timely fashion, would we anticipate having multiple special board meetings to be able to accommodate these changes as needed?
Well, I guess I wouldn't see these types of contracts coming to us regularly on an emergency basis, and that we should know, far enough in advance that, yes, some things will come before us twice, approving a scope of work and then ultimately, to approve the final product. If there is something that comes up on an emergency basis that has to be brought before the board that fits within this category, I guess I can't think of anything in the recent past where that happened, but I guess we'll see how that goes. And a lot of this, from my perspective, let me respond to some of the things that, from my perspective, can we remove it from the consent agenda? Yes, I request that we remove this from the consent agenda. Let's put it on the have discussion. In terms of the range of studies and things like that, I hope it's not going to be an issue. And if it does, then I think we'll tweak this. We don't want 1,000 things being thrown on an agenda. And I hope that's not a plan, but we don't want that to happen for sure. So if we see things becoming too cumbersome and get the real detail from the real life implementation, yeah, I say we go back and take a look. And as Director Tisdale said, retroactive versus moving forward, yeah, anything that has happened, any contract approved in the past is approved in the past, but any change orders and things like that moving forward, this would apply. And finally, just see. With regard to the scope of work stuff, yeah, I mean, to the extent that there's a scope of work approval that fits within the exclusion contract, and I think we got some things out of there that should keep a lot of the technical stuff away from us, but I don't know how we can address that to make sure it doesn't get out in the public. Do we do scope of work reviews in an executive session? Is that an appropriate product for an executive session because it may impact, you know, intellectual property or things like that? So I don't know, but and then when the time is appropriate, I'll read into the record my one amendment to paragraph B6. And I see Ms. Snyder with her hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So we can certainly address the executive session sort of as we go, as we look at potential scopes. There might be things like sensitive security information or other things like that that would warrant an executive session. So that's a really good point. Just one last little quibble with Director Tisdale's point. I totally agree that if the intent, it sounds like, is not to make this language about the reservation of rights, not to intend to undermine any actions already taken by the board, I would just recommend just striking the language that says by this resolution, so that it just says that the board's powers not delegated to the general manager are reserved to the board.
Okay. And I see Director Tisdale shaking his head. Makes sense. So I'm going to move to amend. Are we done with discussion? Any more discussion? Okay, cool. I'm going to move to amend the proposed resolution as follows. And Ms. Snyder, do I need to read the entire motion over and incorporate the amendment? Would that be helpful?
I'll leave it to you. I think it's fine if you want to just highlight the language that you're wanting to amend, and then we can.
All right. So with regard to the current motion that's been approved, I would move to amend the resolution as follows: that in paragraph B6 on packet page 8, page 3 of the resolution, after the first sentence where you see the period, cumulative total of 25% of the original contract amount, continue that sentence with the following language: provided such amount does not exceed $2 million, period. And then the rest of that paragraph remains the same. That should address the concern of extending or amending contracts and having that be an amount over $2 million. And then the final amendment I would propose is with regard to paragraph I as in Ida. I would recommend that should read: the board's powers not delegated to the general manager are reserved to the board, period. That's my amendment. Do I have a motion to approve that amendment?
So moved.
And do I have a second?
Second.
So Geisinger and Catlin in that order. So we have a motion and an approval of amendment, and all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Anybody? Okay. All right, thanks. And thanks for that discussion. And between now and the board meeting, let's give some thought. I think the one kind
Mr.
of
Chairman,
unresolved.
point of order.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Mr. Tisdale.
Don't you now need a motion to approve the resolution as amended? Or
Sorry.
not a motion, a vote on them. There was a motion to approve
Correct.
Reso.
Thanks.
Now you've amended. Now you need the vote on the motion as amended.
Thanks, Robert, for those rules. So we've got an approval of the amendment. Now I go back to the original motion, and we have a motion and a second on the original. Are there any no votes on the original motion? Great. Seeing none, the motion with the resolution as amended will move forward. And I think we just really keep a close look on this because I don't want, you know, this to be cumbersome overly. It's going to be cumbersome. It's overly cumbersome to staff and make their jobs difficult. So let's see how this goes down the road. All right, where am I? Next, We have the July board meeting agenda review. So we have, is there a motion? Okay. We've got the July 26th board meeting agenda that has been presented, and I think what we need to do is amend that. There's another one. Do we approve the original one and then amend it? Ms. Snyder, we've got to include the special board meeting as well. So any suggestions on how we should approach this?
Yes, I think you can just make the motion, call for a motion to approve with the addition of the special board meeting.
Okay, so I need a motion to approve the July 26th agenda with the addition of the special board meeting that incorporates the missed or canceled Operations and Safety Committee meeting items on that agenda, and with the other change of removing the amended delegations from the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve that?
I'll make the motion to proceed.
Thank you, Director Whitmore. Director Geisinger, your hand is raised.
I'll second it. And then did we get the agenda for the special board meeting?
I do not believe the agenda for the special board meeting was included. My understanding is it's the same as the agenda for the Operations and Safety Committee meeting from a week ago or 2 weeks ago. Is that
I
correct?
guess I haven't
Anybody?
looked at that. Are we approving that agenda?
Yes, that's part of the motion here.
Oh, maybe I shouldn't have seconded it.
Well, you
I
can
haven't
withdraw
looked at
your-
that.
Yeah,
We can send it out.
Okay, thank you.
do you still, are you gonna second that motion?
I guess I should look at it. So,
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah,
If I may, and not as a member of the committee, and I ask the committee's indulgence for speaking on this, but the point is, it's just a question of setting forth the agenda. It's not an approval of any of the motions.
right.
If the motions would be submitted under the consent agenda, they would come forward as recommended actions. But in that sense, if you will, it's recommended by staff, and it's simply for the board then to consider it without benefit of an Operations and Safety Committee meeting having been conducted first. So I think your second, Director Geisinger, Madam First Vice Chair, would not in any way, shape, or form constitute an approval of any item proposed, but rather simply that it come forward to the board. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
right,
Thanks
I
for that
understand that.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Thank you. I understand that, but I guess if I'm approving the agenda, I feel like I should look at it, and that's what I haven't seen.
Well,
So,
Okay, oh, I'll take that as a withdrawal of your second, so I'll need a second to the motion before we have discussion. Thanks, Second Vice Chair Catlin, and do you have something further to add?
I do. I have a question, actually. That particular agenda was for the committee, and that was chaired by Director Rosenthal. And now it's going to be a special board meeting, so I assume that the assignments or that Director Busick will run that meeting? Okay, I just wanted to.
Yeah, it's no longer a committee meeting. It's not part of the board meeting. So yeah, we'll run that, and all of those items because they didn't come through, as Director Tisdale indicated, they didn't come through a committee. They will be recommended actions with full discussion and presentation. And I believe the reimagine on that. Yeah. So we'll have a whole presentation just like the committee would have had.
Yeah, and the service changes, but I
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that it was clear to the committee chair that it will be run as a board meeting.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll make sure to reach out to Director Rosenthal.
Thank you.
Anything further? There's a motion and a second to approve the July 26th board meeting agenda as amended. Are there any no votes?
I guess this is both agendas, right?
Yes.
I still haven't seen it.
Okay.
I guess you can put me down as a no vote and everybody else can vote yes, and it won't matter. I
Okay.
just haven't seen it.
Ms. Parrish, do you have a comment?
I just wanted to add that the executive committee has traditionally never approved special board meeting agendas. They've
Oh.
always just been brought forward. They've never been approved, at least since I've been here.
How do those come forward?
Yeah, can anybody give us some of that background?
Sorry,
Okay.
we create the agendas and push them forward based on agency business and agency need.
Yeah, but this is coming, this was once upon a time, a formal agenda of one of our standing committees. So I think we need to approve this one. But thanks for that info. I appreciate that. So we're going to go ahead with the motion as constituted. Anybody else? Anybody? So I'm going to call the roll. Director Catlin,
Yes.
Director Sloan,
Yes.
Director Whitmore,
Yes.
Director Busick, yes. Director Geisinger.
No.
Okay, so that moves forward 4-1. Thanks. I appreciate your concern and need to see that agenda. So, cool. All right, discussion items. We're going to move on to discussion items. We have a couple on the agenda, and the first is the government relations report. And GM CEO Johnson, do you have a report or a designee for the report?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Michael Davies, our Government Relations Officer, will present the report for this month. So with that, I will yield the floor to Mr. Davies.
Mr. Davies, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Chair, members of the committee. Michael Davies, Government Relations Officer. We just have a brief report that will supplement the written government relations report. Starting at the federal level, as written in the report, the House of Representatives at the time had passed the 2023 fiscal year 2023 appropriations process through the committee. And now, as of yesterday, the update is that the full House of Representatives has passed the fiscal year 23 appropriations bill. The issue is that the Senate has not begun any work on that. And there's been no negotiations and agreement on a top line funding figure. So really, this is kind of the action of the House working on their own without agreement on the Senate. And so you really need agreement with the Senate to be able to coordinate both bills. So we'll be watching that closely as the end of the fiscal year comes up on September 30th, 2022. And then lastly, at the federal level, with regard to the credit risk premium return, US DOT staff has indicated that it should be any day now that that funding will be available to RTD to draw down from our FTA account. And so we are also watching that process closely and working well with US DOT staff on these final steps. At the state level, the Colorado Energy Office grant for our Zero Fare for Better Air, that grant application was accepted by the Colorado Energy Office, and staff now is working on the intergovernmental agreements and contract agreements to be able to be reimbursed. The only change I have is that the intent to award originally communicated from the Energy Office was $8,650,000. And in the statement of work that RTD staff is working on, that amount was increased by $30,000. So it'd be $8,680,000 is the intent to award amount at this time. And then at the local level, as indicated in the written report, most of our efforts over this last month were working with the county clerks and gaining feedback on the topic of another item before board consideration, which is the offering zero fare transit services during and around the 2022 general election. And at the meetings that we held and communication we had with the county clerks, as well as the Secretary of State's office, provided feedback for that board item. So with that, that concludes my report, and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks for that report. Any questions for Mr. Davies? There she is, Director Sloan.
Yes. I understand any definitive report would be premature. but it may be of interest to the executive committee if there has been outreach to an additional federal agency, specifically the Department of Health and Human Services.
Yes. Oh, I see General Manager Johnson has raised her hand if she wants to address that.
Ms. Johnson, please go ahead.
So yes, thank you very kindly, and thank you for the question, Director Sloan. It was my intent to give a full-fledged report to the entire board so they would be privy to the information. I am willing to provide a snippet at this point in time, if that is your preference.
Yes.
Yes, so in working in tandem with Director Sloan, she had a meeting and put me in contact with the Region 8 Administrator of Health and Human Services. The genesis for that contact was predicated upon the article that was featured in the Washington Post, as that article profiled a day in the life of one of our operators on the 15 limited route. With that as a backdrop, clearly recognizing there is a clear-cut nexus between public transportation and health impacts collectively. A meeting was arranged via my office with representatives from Health and Human Services. And there were conversations that ensued. The regional director from Health and Human Services put forward some suggestions. A lot of those suggestions are things that RTD is currently working on in relationship of looking at societal issues collectively, opioid usage and things of the like. I in turn as well reached out to our FTA administrator for Region 8, whom I collaborate with on a regular basis, and put forward that I think there needed to be a nexus between FTA and Health and Human Services, recognizing that oftentimes when there's an opportunity to partner, any type of opportunities for grants and things of the like, it really showcases the collaborative spirit when you have a myriad of different agencies. Where we left it quite naturally is working in tandem with Health and Human Services from a federal level or national level, I should qualify it as, to bring forward awareness as relates to these issues that aren't indicative or not, I should say, indigenous to the metropolitan area of Denver. And so the next steps is basically leveraging our contacts with FTA and HSS to have a conversation with metro mayors. Oftentimes what I have seen, and our regional administrator from Health and Human Services recognizes that this is not an issue that is solely impacting the metropolitan area, and wanted to ensure that individuals knew collectively that this is not an issue that totally resonates or it rests with RTD to solve. And we're looking at that collaborative approach to help bring forth the conversation, and also make it more apparent at the state level, since there has been a large uptick in opioid usage throughout the state of Colorado, excuse me. So this is my state, Colorado. So with that, I will provide additional information on Tuesday night. Director Sloan, if there's any questions you may have or any other member assembled, I am more than happy to address those. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that detail. Director Catlin.
Thank you, Chair Busick, and actually, thank you, Ms. Johnson, for that update, and I applaud you and Director Sloan for those efforts. My brief request is of Michael Davies and GM CEO Johnson, that when we finally get that credit risk premium in our FTA account to draw down, would you please send us a message? And I will put you on Zoom and do a cartwheel, because that's been a part of my life for well over a decade now. So I really look forward to hearing that. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if you could indulge me.
Yeah, sure. But just remember, everybody, you heard it here first. Peggy Catlin is doing a cartwheel on Zoom. Go ahead, Ms. Johnson.
Yes, quite naturally, you will hear. There's a myriad of people who have asked to be apprised, and quite naturally, you as the policy body and my bosses will be the first to be aware once I get that confirmation through our TRAMS account. Thank you.
Great,
Thank
thanks.
you. It's been such a long time coming, and Mr. Davies and Ms. Johnson, I appreciate your efforts, and our federal lobbyists and our delegation, quite frankly, for working on our behalf.
Yeah, great work. It's been a long time coming, so good deal. Any other, hang on. So any other questions for Mr. Davies? We're still on the government relations report. No, good deal. Thanks, Mr. Davies. Thanks for that report, as always. Next, we have informal director meetings, next steps. First, Vice Chair Geisinger and Secretary Sloan, do you have any updates you'd like to share with the executive committee?
Marjorie's done such a great job leading this. I'm going to ask her to. She was hoping I would do it.
I was going to defer to you, but you know, there are next steps coming. This has been a long process in trying to make a more effective, efficient way for directors to deal with issues that affect smaller groups within the board. And Director Geisinger is one, Barbara Teichray, Director Deschel, General Counsel Snyder, can all attest to a group effort on this. But it's my understanding, and Barbara, you're the specifics on this, that this proposal will be ready for our September meeting, for the executive committee meeting. And then if it goes through the executive committee on to the full board meeting. If anyone who's participated in this process has anything to add, I would appreciate it.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for your work, and first Vice Chair Geisinger for your work as well, and staff as well. Anybody have anything they'd like to discuss or add to this? First Vice Chair Geisinger, do you have anything you want to add?
Sure. I join Director Sloan and largely thanking her. She's done a lot of work on this, and also, as she said, Teichray and Ms. Snyder and Barbara and all have been very helpful. I think this is I think it's a good piece to let directors meet the requirements of the open meetings law and still get together to move issues forward to the board. Thanks.
Cool, good work, everybody. No other questions or comments on that one. We're going to move on to the timeline and recruitment process for board office executive manager. So as you all know, Ms. McManus will be leaving us in the approaching future. And the question is, how do we go about recruiting for that position? I've had discussions with some of you on the executive committee. I've had discussions with our general manager and with our general counsel. My preference is to have this recruitment process for this position handled internally. I believe we have the scope and the bandwidth to handle this, and I can't in good conscience say that we should incur funds for hiring an outside firm to do this. And I guess I'd want some discussion and comments from the other members of the executive committee on this. I'll start with Director Whitmore. I'm just going to call on you so you don't have to raise your hand.
Well, I concur with, at least at this point, Mr. Chair, I concur with your viewpoint. I think we should proceed in that manner, at least for now, and see where it leads us. So short and to the point.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I'm not taking any formal action here. I'm just seeking input and comments. Director Catlin.
Thank you. I agree. I think that I raised the question of bandwidth when we brought this up earlier, and it sounds like we do have in-house capacity to do this. And it's my feeling that we need to get started on this sooner than later, and to take the time to hire an outside consultant would just prolong the activity. So I'm in support of your suggestion as well.
Okay. Director Geisinger, I see you're unmuted. Why don't you talk?
I agree. I agree with those comments. Let's move it forward. Thanks.
Secretary Sloan.
I am also in agreement and am willing to offer up some time in addition to the Amazon gift cards that you asked for this morning. I'm sorry you were in such a bad position, but it happens. Just so many people need Amazon gift cards. I would offer up my time because I think it's essential that we need to review the job description and requirements. HR will be so effective in doing that, but I think it would be helpful to have board input in the first instance.
Cool. Thanks for those comments. And just for a point of clarification, what Director Sloan is referring to is apparently someone is claiming to be me and asking for Amazon gift cards or bail money or something like that. So it's not me, but if you want to send me bail money and Amazon gift cards, please just hand deliver them. That'd be fine. Good. So I think we're moving forward on the recruitment timeline process, and we'll keep that moving. I don't think there's anything else on the agenda. Any other matters to come before the executive committee? First, Vice Chair Geisinger, please.
I have a question about the SOP that's coming to the board meeting, and maybe just an initial conversation now. I guess it's a question for Ms. Johnson. Just talking to constituents and looking at some of what, I know some of what's going on. There are a lot of pieces, routes, service that are in discussion. The 128 is not coming back, but they're looking at a flex ride. The FF4, there's concern that it's not bidirectional, and my understanding with staff is that it has to be to make the interlining work. The 122X, I think, has a similar discussion ongoing, and I'm just trying to figure out how those fit with the SOP if they're not listed on the SOP, which gets me back to the question of what's the effect of the SOP? Are we still telling our service planners to move forward on some of these things?
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yes, please, Ms. Johnson.
So just for everybody's clarification, I want to start with a qualifier, recognizing that the system optimization plan is a branded name that we have at RTD for a comprehensive operations analysis. We've done an analysis of our routes and rail lines. This is merely a plan to help provide guidance as we go forward. You as a body adopted guiding principles back in April of 2021, in which there are 6 that enable us to make informed decisions as relates to what might be optimal in reference to transit service delivery. Recognizing that COAs are customarily done at other transit agencies every 5 to 7 years. This is a guiding tool for all intents and purposes and could not quite naturally encompass every single facet of what we have going forward. So with that as a backdrop, First Vice Chair Geisinger, when we talk about things that are ongoing, looking at system optimization, how we're going to leverage that for our service delivery perspective, we will take into consideration looking through the lens of equity, accessibility, and looking at the cost as we want to ensure that we're optimizing our revenue service hours going forward. Those decisions will be made collective to that. And quite naturally, when we do service restoration, it comes back to this body with the information going forward relative to you all making a decision about adopting any type of service modifications.
So they just come forward to us as part of a service, a regular service run, and it might have some. It would presumably mostly have service, routes that are in the SOP, but it might include others that are coming to us for changes.
That's exactly so. And what I will say, I'm gonna step outside of myself for a minute. And First Vice Chair Geisinger and I had an opportunity to have a discussion. And I did provide for her my viewpoint, being in this industry for 30 years relative to what COAs are intended to do. If in fact we were doing our COAs with regular cadence every 5 to 7 years, there was a question about the plan for 2050. recognizing that in 2027, we should be looking at this again. That would take us basically to 2032, and then
Right.
looking at 2037 as we go forward, because there's going to be change in land use. There could be different developments that's happening, and we, as a provider of mobility options, need to ensure that we are doing an analysis to determine where, in fact, we need to provide mobility options. So I say that because she's smiling at me. This preceded me, and what I'm trying to say is that there's an opportunity, and if there was some kind of continuity with this, it wouldn't seem as arduous, but this is par for the course. And so just want you all to know that this is just an analysis. It's a plan. And we can plan and plan and plan, but there's always going to be other factors, but it helps guide us going forward. So thank you very much, First Chair Geisinger, for the question.
And thank you for the answer. That makes sense to me. I may ask it again in the board meeting, just so everybody
Okay.
can hear. And, you know, the way, and Ms. Johnson and I had this conversation also, the reason that question is coming up about this is a 5-year plan is that in our study session on the mobility plan for the future, it said, if we don't get any new money, the SOP will govern until 2050. And I said, what's that about? So I guess I still would like to see that change, that language out of the mobility plan for the future. And that raises the question for me too, that, you know, what's our role with the mobility plan for the future? And we talked about that. You said, well, I don't know if you want to approve it and make it a, you know, a set plan. But maybe there is, you mentioned maybe there's a resolution or something. I sure would like to see it come back to us because we got the study session before we got the mobility plan. You know, there's things in there that I think we should consider, like the partnership criteria and some things like that. So I'm just putting that out there as you know, maybe we discussed that at the board meeting. I think you and I were kind of on the same page, you know, that it could come back in some form. So thanks.
Ms. Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, First Chair Geisinger, for the clarification. I do want to state what I shared was that it's not good practice to adopt a plan for 25 years saying this is what we're going to do. What I had shared with First Chair Geisinger going forward, that it could be in the form of a resolution if this board is so inclined, where you know, support the concept going forward, recognizing you have the incremental steps. And I would agree with First Chair Geisinger, and that's what prompted the conversation, that there's no way, shape, or form that we would sit idle and say we did a study in 2022 when we're using that as a model to carry us in 2050, because there should be analyses that take place going forward. So yes, First Chair Geisinger did have conversations with the team relative to that matter that was presented by the consultant team, and that is not necessarily reflective of the intent of the mobility plan for the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thanks for that input and those comments. And yeah, I remember in 2019 at the very first board retreat that we had, scratching my head and wondering, why don't we have aspirational goals? I mean, you know, we're always like looking at our feet and saying, oh, we've got to do this today and not looking at tomorrow. But I think that mobility plan for the future really gives us the ability to think about that stuff. So pretty cool. Second Vice Chair Catlin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to inform this group that we had our kickoff meeting for the internal audit function with Ruben Brown. And I think we had a really good discussion. And they were very open about presenting us with options for a committee structure, audit committee structure going forward. And we're willing to be really flexible. And I was very pleased with how that discussion went. I would like to note that in addition to Directors Deschel and Davidson and myself, Director Geisinger participated, and I appreciated her attendance, but that was the only other board member that was able to attend. That being said, even though we're taking a pause for August meetings, we have some fairly significant milestones that we need to reach within the next 8 weeks in establishing the audit committee. And so chances are we will be meeting, with all apologies to staff, through the month of August. And we have asked the consultant to put together a timeline and kind of a work plan so that we have a clear scope of what's going to be discussed at each of those meetings. So those will be coming out here in the next few days. We will be meeting this next Monday. Anyone who's interested in attending.
Thanks, Second Vice Chair Catlin, and thanks for your work on that committee. First Vice Chair Geisinger, your hand's still up. Do you have anything more? Okay,
I apologize.
no problem. Director Tisdale.
Thank you very much. Just for the sake of the record, and with all due respect to Director Catlin, I was actually in that audit committee meeting as well, because I mentioned the fact that when they mentioned external members of the committee, I wanted to know if the various agencies, entities, or companies that were being considered for external membership on our audit committee also had external members on their own internal audit committees. Thank you.
Thank you, and I stand corrected, and I do apologize, but I didn't see your shining face. You were on the phone, so that's why I forgot.
Good deal. Thanks for that. Any other matters to come before the committee? So just a reminder, August is kind of a regrouping month for board, staff, everybody. So there's not a lot happening. So keep that in mind. Staff's going to be busy doing their regrouping as we will. So I understand the audit committee may need to be meeting. Hopefully we can trim that down a little, but we'll see. Seeing no other discussion, I will call this meeting adjourned at 1:13 p.m. Thanks everybody for being here.